My name is Tessa Caldwell, and I am 31 years old. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was the safest way to keep peace in my family. I told myself that silence was maturity, that swallowing the small humiliations was easier than starting a conflict no one wanted to acknowledge. That belief changed during the family gathering in my grandmother's backyard under the soft lights and the easy laughter that always made everything look better than it really was. My sister Marissa sat across from me. She always knew how to hold attention without asking for it, directly tilting her head and smiling just enough to make others lean in. When the table shifted into one of those natural pauses that happen between shared stories, she took the moment as if it had been saved for her. She looked straight at me, her voice smooth and practiced, and said, "You're not even worthy to shine my shoes." Her words did not surprise me, not really. What struck me was the silence that followed her tone, a silence that held expectation rather than shock. My father released a short laugh, the kind that signals approval more than humor, and I recognized the pattern I had lived under for years play out again in front of me. I placed my glass down slowly, steadying my breath, so my hands would not betray what my heart was doing. I met Marissa's eyes and told her clearly and without raising my voice, "If that is how you see me, then you can start paying your own bills beginning tomorrow." The moment the words left my mouth, my mother choked on her drink, coughing into her napkin while her eyes widened in disbelief. The rest of the table fell into a still and heavy quiet, the kind that reveals more truth than any argument ever could. Before the story continues, comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Growing up in our house felt like living inside a story that had already been written long before I understood how to read it. My sister Marissa came into the world with a kind of natural brightness that people immediately responded to. She laughed easily, spoke confidently, and always seemed to know exactly how to catch a room's attention without appearing to try. When relatives gathered, they leaned toward her, asking questions, praising her tone, her hair, her posture, her small achievements that were celebrated as if they were milestones. I do not remember being jealous. I remember watching. I remember learning what earned warmth and what did not. My father valued presence performance, the ability to project self-assurance. He responded to Marissa with encouragement that came quickly and visibly, clapping his hands at her school recitals, retelling stories, where she shined as if those stories were part of family lore. When Marissa voiced an opinion, even if it lacked substance, he treated it as wise. When she struggled, he framed it as evidence that she was striving for greatness. My mother had a softer approach, but the pattern was similar. She brushed Marissa's hair while humming, complimenting her features, reminding her that she was meant to be seen, that some people were simply born to stand in the center of things. She did not say that others were not, but she did not have to. I understood my role without being told. I learned how to help with dinner, how to carry groceries quietly and efficiently, how to fold laundry so no one would need to redo it. I did my homework without being asked. I learned how to sense the early signs of tension in the room and how to smooth them over before they became visible. If something spilled, I cleaned it before anyone noticed. If someone raised their voice, I softened mine. There was a kind of stability that came from handling the things that kept daily life moving, and I found a quiet pride in being the one who could be relied on. But when you are young, you do not realize that reliability can become invisibility when no one is looking for the hands supporting the weight. Marissa grew accustomed to being the focus of the household. When she was praised, she expected it. When she wanted something, she asked with the confidence of someone who believed wanting was enough to justify receiving. She learned early that the family would rearrange itself around her preferences, her schedule, her moods, and she stepped into that role with such ease that questioning it felt like questioning the structure of our home itself. I, on the other hand, learned silence. Not the silence that comes from shyness, but the silence that grows from understanding your reactions will not change the outcome. I learned to listen rather than speak to accept, rather than challenge to endure, rather than disrupt. People sometimes mistake that kind of quiet for gentleness, but it is a form of endurance. It is the sound of choosing the path of least resistance, because you already know where resistance leads. I became the person who handled tasks in the background, who held emotions inside, who never asked for more than what was already given. That childhood did not feel painful while I was living it. It simply felt like the only way the house could stay balanced. Only later did I understand the cost of being the one who holds things together without anyone noticing they were ever at risk of falling apart. A few years later, I had finished school and stepped into the adult world with the steady pace of someone who had spent a long time observing before acting. I found a job at a small bookkeeping firm downtown, nothing glamorous but stable in a way that felt like a foundation rather than a spotlight. The work fit me. Numbers were clear in a way people were not. With each paycheck, I felt myself exhale a little more, believing I was creating something of my own that no one could take credit for. During that same period, my family's dynamics did not shift as much as I had quietly hoped. Responsibility did not spread evenly. My parents continued to see my effort as something natural, almost expected, as though I had simply grown into the role they had always assigned me. When I brought home groceries or helped cover a bill because a payment date had slipped past them, gratitude was rarely spoken aloud. It was treated like the weather present, normal, unremarkable. Marissa, meanwhile, had leaned further into performance. She worked sporadically, always in roles that allowed her to be visible, surrounded, admired. She changed jobs often, each time announcing it as a step towards something bigger, though the bigger thing never seemed to arrive. Even so, when she walked into a room, my parents' faces lit up like her presence alone confirmed they had raised someone exceptional. She had a way of speaking that made ordinary things sound grand, and they responded as if they had been waiting all day to applaud. With time, my income became woven into the household without discussion. If the electric bill was higher one month, I was simply told the amount. If my mother needed new tires, she would casually mention it over dinner, waiting for me to fill the silence. I did not object. My agreement was not enthusiastic, but quiet and consistent, which made it seem effortless to them. The truth was that I measured what I gave not in dollars, but in the weight of what it kept from collapsing. I told myself I was preventing arguments, easing stress, keeping things peaceful. Marissa noticed this dynamic too, though not in a way that stirred empathy. She treated my contributions as proof that I was steady, predictable, easy to rely on. She developed a way of thanking me that was almost a performance in itself. Soft smiles and light touches, as though she were indulging me in a role I should be proud to hold. To her, I was useful. To my parents, I was stable. To myself, I was carrying weight no one acknowledged existed. I remember one evening when I sat at the dining table sorting receipts for my father, while he and Marissa planned a weekend outing. Their conversation floated just above my head, filled with talk of restaurants, new outfits, and the best lighting for photos. Neither paused to ask whether I wanted to join. I had work to finish, and besides, I knew my presence would only shift the tone. I existed, but I did not occupy space. Still, I stayed. I told myself that being needed was a form of belonging, even if the belonging was conditional. I kept peace by disappearing into the background and playing the part they expected me to fill. I convinced myself that patience was strength, and that strength meant waiting for something to change on its own. But change does not arrive uninvited, and the longer I remained in that quiet role, the more invisible I became to the people I loved. One sweltering summer when the heat seemed to settle over everything, and the days moved in a slow, heavy rhythm, the quiet pattern in our household shifted into something more consuming. It began subtly with a medical expense that Mom needed handled. I paid it without hesitation because I had stable work, and it felt like the natural thing to do. Then Dad's truck broke down, and the repair cost exceeded what they expected. I covered that too. Soon, groceries seemed to fall into my hands every week, followed by household supplies, utilities, and insurance renewals. None of these moments felt dramatic on their own. They unfolded in soft comments, small sighs, or brief mentions over dinner, but the expectation was persistent. The unspoken message was clear: I would handle it. I always did. During that same summer, Marissa leaned deeper into her crafted image of success. She was rarely working steady hours, yet she hosted gatherings at the house that looked like magazine spreads. Coordinated decor, curated playlists, outfits chosen not for comfort, but for how they would appear in photos. She would laugh with her friends and talk about new opportunities on the horizon, presenting herself as someone who was already living the life she imagined. Mom and Dad adored these gatherings. They praised Marissa's charm, her ability to light up the room, and spoke as though her social presence was a talent that held real weight. No one acknowledged the cost behind it, or where the money for these events actually came from. I watched the dynamic deepen. My support made her performance possible, and her performance reinforced the belief that she was exceptional. Mom played a very particular role in maintaining the imbalance. If I paused before agreeing to pay an expense, she would soften her voice and speak about family unity, implying that love meant stepping in without hesitation. Her words carried warmth, but her silence, whenever the pressure fell on me, spoke louder. She never demanded directly. The absence of acknowledgement was enough to keep me compliant. Dad rarely questioned the pattern either. He accepted my contributions with quiet comfort, as though I was simply fulfilling a duty assigned by birth. What I did not see at first was how far the financial strain had reached. Small withdrawals began appearing on my bank statements, amounts that blended into the background of regular expenses. I overlooked them because I believed I was aware of everything I spent. I thought responsibility meant not questioning, only managing, but small patterns grow when no one interrupts them. Meanwhile, Marissa continued to refine the narrative she lived inside. She began speaking about ventures she planned to launch, collaborations with people she admired, invitations to exclusive events that always seemed to be just out of reach, yet used as proof of imminent success. Mom and Dad believed every word with unwavering confidence. They saw her as someone moving upward while I was simply steady, which in their eyes meant dependable to the point of invisibility. I told myself that supporting them was the right thing to do, that families go through phases, that one day I would be the one receiving help. I convinced myself that patience was strength and that loyalty meant endurance. I did not yet understand that love without boundaries teaches others to take without measure. And that summer, the taking became normalized, gentle in tone, but constant in effect, until questioning it felt like disrupting something sacred. One late evening, after I returned home from work, and the house had settled into its usual quiet, I opened my laptop to check my email before bed. There was a notification from my bank flagged as important, a security alert regarding several transactions that appeared inconsistent with my usual spending. At first, I assumed it was an automated review because I had paid a few larger household expenses recently, so I clicked, expecting reassurance that everything was normal. Instead, the statement showed a series of purchases from a boutique across town, the kind of place known for limited-release designer items and curated lifestyle branding. The amounts were significant enough that I would never forget making them, yet I had no memory of these transactions. For a moment, my breath caught as I reviewed them more slowly, scrolling back and forth through the history, making sure I was not misreading anything. I did not rush to confront anyone. The impulse was there quick and hot, but I knew that reacting without clarity would only result in confusion or excuses. Instead, I closed my laptop, breathed deeply, and decided I needed to collect everything in undeniable order. I took out a notebook I kept for personal budgeting and compared the timestamps to the dates when I had been at work or running errands. I remembered my card being in my wallet the entire time, which meant the access had come from elsewhere. I felt a strange mix of numbness and clarity settling in the kind that comes when reality shifts slowly enough that you can see it happening while still hoping it is not true. The next morning on my lunch break, I went to the bank in person. I asked to print full statements covering the past several months, and the teller processed the request with polite efficiency, unaware of what I suspected. Holding the papers in my hands made everything feel heavier. The pattern was now unmistakable. The withdrawals had begun small, nearly invisible, but had grown in frequency and amount. They matched specific dates when Marissa had hosted gatherings or posted about new clothing. New accessories outings she described as spontaneous celebrations of her progress. Each highlight of her public image had an echo in my account. I did not tell Mom or Dad anything yet. I wanted the truth organized before I spoke it aloud. At home that evening, I spread the printed statements across my bedroom floor and highlighted each questionable charge. I opened my laptop again and took screenshots of account access logs noting the device signatures. I saved everything into folders labeled by date. The work was methodical, almost calming, as if the structure of evidence could steady the emotional ground beneath me. It was the first time in a long time that I felt I was acting for myself, instead of absorbing responsibility for others. At one point I paused, overwhelmed by the weight of what I now understood. I texted Noah, a coworker who had become a gentle presence in my life. We had never discussed my family in detail, but he had seen enough to recognize strain when it surfaced behind my eyes. He did not ask for explanations when I messaged him. He simply replied that he was there, that I did not have to carry everything alone, even if the decisions ahead were mine. His support did not take the form of advice or opinion. It was a steadiness I could lean on without losing my balance. I continued arranging each piece of information until the entire timeline was clear. I now had proof context and a picture of how long my account had been tapped without my knowledge. There was no more doubt about where the money had gone or why the imbalance in our home had deepened so sharply. The truth was no longer something I felt. It was something I could show. The following weekend at my grandparents' backyard, where our extended family often gathered for birthdays and summer meals, the atmosphere felt almost ordinary at first. The grill was already hot, cousins chased each other across the lawn, and familiar conversations floated in soft circles as chairs were unfolded around long picnic tables. The setting was gentle, but beneath my calm exterior, I carried something deliberate and weighted. I had placed all the printed statements and screenshots into a slim folder, the kind that did not draw attention until opened. I had rehearsed this sequence in my mind not to dramatize anything, but to ensure clarity that could not be redirected or softened. We sat down together when most of the noise around us had settled into a steady background hum. Mom asked if I wanted lemonade, unaware of the purpose behind the gathering. Dad leaned back in his chair with an ease that came from assuming the day would continue like any other family afternoon. Marissa adjusted her sunglasses and smiled as though the world existed primarily to receive her expressions. I waited until everyone was settled, until no one could claim they were distracted. I began by stating that I needed to review some financial matters that directly affected me. My voice did not rise, tremble, or push for attention. It simply held steady. I opened the folder and laid out the first sheets of statements. I explained the progression, how the transactions had begun small and increased over time, how they matched specific dates tied to events Marissa had hosted and items she had recently acquired. The numbers were exact, the timestamps precise, and the tone neutral. I did not accuse. I presented. Marissa's initial reaction was a light laugh, the kind meant to dismiss the seriousness of the moment. She said she did not know what I was talking about, as though confusion could erase documentation. I slid another set of papers toward the center of the table, these showing device access logs. Her laugh faltered. She looked toward Mom, waiting for support, but Mom remained still, eyes flickering between the papers and Marissa's face, as if trying to reorder reality into something that made sense. Dad cleared his throat and suggested that maybe there was an error at the bank, that sometimes transactions were mislabeled or processed incorrectly. I nodded once, acknowledging the possibility, and then I pulled out the set of statements I had obtained in person. The teller's stamp was visible. The device ID matched Marissa's phone. The total amount was no longer something that could be interpreted as misunderstanding. It was intentional. Marissa's hands began to tremble slightly as she searched for something to say. She mentioned stress, expectations, needing to keep up, not wanting to fall behind in the image she had built. The words came out unevenly, not as justification, but as fragments of panic. The silence that followed held more weight than any argument could have. No one raised their voice. No accusations were shouted. There was only the undeniable presence of proof. Mom looked at me with a kind of recognition that came too late. Dad leaned forward, but he had no angle left to deflect the reality laid out before him. The air felt heavier, as though everyone there understood that something fundamental had shifted, not just in our conversation, but in the structure of our family itself. The image we had lived inside, the roles assumed and reinforced for years, had cracked. I gathered the papers, slowly placing each sheet back into the folder without haste. I did not ask for apologies or explanations. I did not speak about betrayal or disappointment. The truth did not require commentary. It simply needed to be seen and acknowledged. And in that backyard, surrounded by family and familiarity, they saw it clearly for the first time. 1 month later, the atmosphere around my family had shifted in ways that were subtle only on the surface. Beneath each conversation and silence, something fundamental had changed, something that could not be undone through apologies or shared meals. Life had moved forward, but not gently. The world continued to demand its prices, and without the financial structure I had unknowingly been supporting, the cracks that had been present for years began to show clearly. Marissa was the first to encounter visible consequences. The lifestyle she had built around curated images, social gatherings, and polished confidence depended heavily on perception. When the documents surfaced within the extended family, it did not take long before the information traveled further. A brand she had been collaborating with decided to postpone a campaign indefinitely due to what they referred to as reputational inconsistency. Another company ended a contract citing budget restructuring, though everyone understood the real reason without needing clarification. Invitations slowed. Messages she once received with enthusiasm became sparse. The presence she had projected no longer held the same authority when the foundation of it had been exposed as borrowed rather than earned. She tried to maintain the same brightness in her expressions, the same elevated tone in her speech, but the effort showed. The strain was visible in the way she adjusted her posture and how she avoided eye contact in the pauses before she answered simple questions. At home, the financial impact echoed louder. Without my support covering routine costs, bills that had once been handled with assumed ease began to accumulate. The insurance payment that had been scheduled automatically did not go through 1 month. A notice arrived. Then another. When Dad applied for a loan intended to bridge the gap temporarily, the bank reviewed the household credit history and declined the request. The financial score had already begun to drop due to late payments on accounts I had not been aware even existed. Mom attempted to negotiate with representatives on the phone, her tone polite at first, then strained, then quiet. The conversations ended the same way. The situation required funds that were no longer available. I did not step in. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of understanding. The moment I intervened, the cycle would rebuild itself exactly as before. The imbalance had not been an accident. It had been sustained through expectation, habit, and silence. Removing myself meant allowing reality to meet consequence without interference. That was the only way anything could change. My interactions with them grew limited. I did not block calls or refuse messages, but I answered in ways that acknowledged connection without providing rescue. If they asked how I was, I responded. If they attempted to redirect the conversation toward finances, I redirected it back to general matters or ended the discussion. Boundaries, once nearly invisible, became solid and unmistakable. The emotional distance felt unfamiliar at first, as though I was adjusting to a home with different architecture. But slowly, it began to feel correct. The quiet inside my apartment no longer held tension. I cooked meals for myself rather than for others who expected them. I handled my own schedule without fitting it around crises I had not created. The absence of weight did not feel empty. It felt earned. As for Marissa, she learned to live without the audience she once believed essential. She took fewer photos. Her voice softened. The performance became thinner until it faded. She did not apologize directly, at least not in words, but there were moments where her eyes held a recognition she had once refused to acknowledge. That was enough. Life had adjusted her more effectively than any confrontation could have. Mom and Dad adapted slowly. They downsized certain expenses, reconsidered plans, and learned to manage through actual, rather than assumed means. They did not become different people overnight. But they began to live within the structure of reality rather than the shelter I had provided. Each of us continued forward. Not together, not in conflict, but in honesty. A month after I stepped back entirely, I signed the lease for my apartment. It sat on the third floor of a quiet brick building, close enough to the city to feel connected but far enough that traffic did not intrude on evenings. I carried each box inside myself. There was no audience, no commentary, no subtle comparison to anyone else. The keys felt solid in my hand. They belonged to me because I had earned them, not because someone allowed or expected me to. The first night I slept there, the space felt unfamiliar, not because it was empty, but because it held no expectations. There were no requests waiting, no unspoken burdens, no assumptions. I woke the next morning to light that filtered through the blinds, steady and calm, and understood that I had crossed into a life that was not shared through obligation. I brewed coffee in a kitchen I did not have to defend or justify. I set the mug down and realized I did not miss the chaos I had once mistaken for belonging. Mom called occasionally to ask how I was doing. Her voice held something softer than before, something more aware. I answered with sincerity, without closing the door but without reopening the old patterns. She did not ask for money. She did not mention bills. We spoke about ordinary things like weather, meals, and books. For the first time, our conversations felt like two adults speaking, not like someone leaning and someone being leaned on. That quiet shift meant more than any apology could have. Dad spoke less. When he did, his tone carried pauses that had not been present before. He no longer assumed I would step in. He no longer treated my effort as owed. The absence of expectation was not apology, but acknowledgement. It was enough. Marissa and I crossed paths only once during that month. It was at the grocery store near my building. She looked different than she had before, not in appearance, but in how she stood. Less posed, less calculated. She hesitated before speaking, as if weighing whether her usual tone still belonged anywhere. When she asked how I had been, her voice did not hold superiority or performance. It held uncertainty. I answered honestly that I was doing well. She nodded slowly in a way that conveyed understanding rather than challenge. She did not apologize. I did not ask her to. Some truths do not require dialogue to be understood. In my new life, there was no dramatic closure, no moment of triumph or collapse, just steadiness. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I arranged the living room so it felt inviting. I placed small plants near the window to watch them grow. I learned the quiet rhythm of existing on my own terms. Freedom did not feel loud. It felt like breathing without effort. I did not wish harm on my family. I did not hold anger. I simply did not return to the role I once occupied. Loving someone does not mean carrying what they refuse to hold. Relationships require boundaries to remain love rather than weight. Love without boundaries becomes burden. Affection that demands sacrifice without acknowledgement is not devotion, but imbalance. When we give endlessly, those who receive forget that the giving is a choice. Choosing yourself does not mean abandoning others. It means recognizing that your needs matter too. Distance is sometimes the most compassionate answer because it allows every person to see themselves clearly and to grow in ways comfort never permits. Thank you for listening to my story. Stories like this are not simple, and they are rarely clean, but sharing them reminds us that we are not alone in navigating the weight of family. I would truly like to hear your perspective. What does family mean to you, and where do you draw your boundaries? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here.